Good afternoon and welcome to this forum on the Building Safety Act. I'm Robert Kelly from Stewart Title, and we're pleased to be running this forum. It's the last of our sessions in 2023. Throughout the year, we have run dozens of webinars and forums, and throughout all of them, we've had many thousands of lawyers attend, but in nearly every session, the spectre of the BSA has come up. So it's perhaps inevitable that we should be looking at it for this final session. But this isn't like one of those TV reviews of the year. I'm pleased to say that Ian Quayle has spent a lot of time this year talking to lawyers, lenders, PI insurers and the government about the impact of the law, and has been garnering some useful tips on how you can still safely deal with leasehold properties. In addition, we're very lucky today that Fiona Cudworth-Elks from the Levelling Up Department is joining us. Fiona and her team have been doing a lot of work, often not well publicised, to deal with queries raised by lawyers and problems they face, particularly as regards lenders, and she'll be able to talk about some of those today. As you would expect, we've had a great number of questions from you already about the BSA, and Fiona and Ian will try to consider as many of those as possible. However, this is a forum, so please use the chat function to contribute to the session. And if we aren't able to deal with your questions today or points raised, then Ian and Fiona will endeavour to answer them in writing, and we will circulate those to you. As I mentioned, this is just the latest in a series of webinars and forums which Stewart Title has run for lawyers this year, and we've tried to cover all areas of interest to you, even where, like the BSA, there isn't yet a title insurance solution. The reason behind this is that we are only title insurers, and therefore, like you, we specialise in property. Like you, this means we need to get property transactions to complete in order to earn money. So we are part of your team when you're instructed, and we want to be a full and energetic partner with you. So please, you'll see our contact details on the screen there. Feel free to get in contact to discuss BSA, other issues which you face at any time, because your success is always our success, and even more so going into 2024. So enough from me. We have two wise speakers, which I guess means we're only a camel and a couple of shepherds short of our annual nativity play. So I'll hand over to Ian, if you could start, please.
Thanks very much, Robert. I think we've got one wise lady, and God knows what I am. I don't think I even qualify as a shepherd, but thank you very much for that introduction. Massive thank you to Stewart Title over the year. Robert, Stephen, Freddie and the team have been brilliant people to deal with, a lovely organisation to deal with, and very supportive of the profession, not only with regard to product and service in connection with title indemnity insurance, but also enabling me to say what I think about lots and lots of things for what that's worth. So again, a huge thank you to Stephen and Robert and their team for organising events such as this. And again, a massive, massive thank you to Fiona. Before we start dealing with the questions and having a look at some of the issues that I'd like to discuss this afternoon, I have to say, as far as the Department of Levelling Up is concerned, throughout my involvement, they have been very receptive and to questions and queries, very welcoming as far as participation is concerned in what has been quite a traumatic year for conveyancers. And it's credit to Fiona and her colleagues that she's quite happy to come along to this event. And I think, Fiona, you've attended lots and lots of other events, both face-to-face and webinars, in order to try and help. And certainly every question that I've posed, every issue that I've sort of raised with the department has been dealt with efficiently and fairly. And it's a complicated piece of legislation. It's a piece of legislation that at its heart has a really good and important message to get across there, and is there to design to protect leaseholders, etc. And within that spirit, I think it's important for the profession to attempt to work with it and to work with the department to try and ensure that transactions are transacted, whilst at the same time ensuring that the spirit of the Act, protecting leaseholders, making sure that parties who have dealt with works that now require remediation paying for that remediation. And hopefully, as I say, this session will be very informative and very useful. And I'm fairly confident, Fiona, that next year there will still be questions and issues about the BSA. And I'm equally confident that you and your colleagues will be just as receptive in 2024 as you have been in 2023 to assist. So what I would like to do to start today is just, first of all, say, as I always do with regards to the BSA, just what a complicated piece of legislation this is that potentially impacts on new builds. It potentially impacts on all manner of different types of building, mixed use buildings, etc., and isn't really condensed to look at residential leases in high-rise buildings. It's far more than that. But what I've done on this slide is just broken down the key elements of the Act. And what I'm really interested in is Part 4 in higher risk buildings, Part 5 and safety standards, remediation of defects, etc. But when we start looking at the role of the building safety regulator and Part 3, amendments to the Building Act 1984, there's an awful lot of things with regard to those sections of the Act and those parts of the Act that will impact on our work as transactional property lawyers, and will probably impact even more on those of you that are advising landlords and building owners. So it's a huge piece of legislation, complex in its scope and extent, and lots of things to talk about and lots of things to do. So we'll start the sort of Q&A now, and we've been inundated, to be fair, with lots of questions. I think we are recording this event, so if you do have to pop in and out, you can get a copy of the recording. And as I say, Fiona and I will make a note of questions that we're unable to deal with or don't have time to deal with, and we'll get back to you with sort of written responses relating to those as time permits. But we've had some questions to start with. First of all, Fiona, welcome to today. Thank you for coming along. It'd be lovely if you could just share with attendees today a little bit about who you are, a little bit about what you've been doing, and just sort of set the scene before we start diving into the questions. So over to you for a moment or two, Fiona.
Absolutely, thanks Ian, and thanks for having me. So yes, I am Fiona Cudworth-Phelps. I'm a policy lead within the lending team for Department for Levelling Up Housing Communities, and my role, I suppose, is to work with the consumer facing ecosystem, so that's conveyancers, mortgage brokers, estate agents, to myth bust and make sure that quality guidance is available to all parties, to help them understand the Building Safety Act. Also acting as a point of contact for those parties to provide feedback into central governments and all of other elements of the ecosystem that kind of my team work with, so lenders, valuers and financial trade associations, and the overarching purpose being to give consumers better access, so to more conveyancers, and to get a better service from all of those parties. And a large part of my role since I joined this team only in August this year has been around pursuing the requirement of guidance for conveyancers on the Building Safety Act, and we're lucky that the Law Society are producing this guidance at the moment. We're feeding into it to make sure that it tries to address a lot of the issues that have been raised by yourselves, by other colleagues. So for example, things like making it really clear around landlord certificates not being received within 4 weeks to kind of move on with transactions, because the lenders know about this. So they know that if a landlord certificate hasn't been received within 4 weeks, then there's that protection that the leaseholder gets and will waive that need if they were requesting for a landlord certificate. Things around kind of receiving letters instead of landlord certificates, and around the kind of developer schemes that Ian touched on. So making sure that you know what the kind of requirements are there, what it means, the kind of coverage that developers will do for remediation works, and therefore all leaseholders, regardless of qualifying status, not having to pay out. But we're listening to a lot of the feedback from stakeholders. You know, there have been regulatory amendments that ensure leasehold protections have the effect in the way that it was originally intended to improve implementation. So things like recently within the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, we solved the issue where qualifying leases couldn't be extended without losing their qualifying status. And we are building on the legislation as well from the BSA for freeholders and developers to make sure that they're not escaping their liabilities. And we're also listening to how we can improve things on gov.uk. So the guidance that's on there, making it easy for the public to understand information about the BSA, and also for you guys, so you're not having to go through pages of legislation, because there should be a lot of that that's in the kind of more public domain, I suppose, on gov.uk, that's easy for you to stand. So I'll do my best to answer the questions that you asked today, but like Ian said, anything that you kind of raise that either can't be answered or we need to come back on, I'll happily do that after the session, and we'll produce something for you guys to take away.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. So shall I start then with a question? One of the things that I'm asked about all the time by conveyancers is this issue of the height of a building, because obviously we've got relevant buildings at 5 stories, 11 metres. We've got higher risk buildings, 7 stories and 18 metres. And a question that I'm asked probably on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, is what do I do to verify the height of a building? And my view, Fiona, is if a building is a higher risk building, it requires registration. If it's been registered, as long as we can get whoever registered it to confirm it's been registered and provided with proof, tick, we know it's a relevant building and we know it's a higher risk building on the height issue. But what would you say if we're dealing with a conveyancer where the building isn't a higher risk building and therefore isn't registered, and we're looking to someone to tell us about the height of a building? Who can we rely on, and what happens if we can't rely on anyone? What's your view, and what's your colleagues' view on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't expect conveyancers to verify the height of buildings. You know, we don't expect you to be getting your tape measures out by any stretch of the imagination. And hopefully there's only going to be a very small number of instances where the height of the building or the number of floors is in dispute. Information like this should be held by building management agents, landlords, or the kind of original developer. And they're the ones who should have the accurate information on the kind of height of the building or floors. It's really not something where we would ever think that kind of conveyancers should be the ones to verify that. It should be those other parties who have that information, and that information should be able to be reliably extracted as part of the kind of the process of selling one of these properties.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fiona. So what I say to practitioners is, it's not, you're quite right, you can't verify the height of a building. You can rely on third parties to provide assistance, but I'm saying to practitioners, when you're scoping the retainer, explain to both the seller client and the buyer client that as a conveyancer, it's impossible for us to verify the height of a building. We've been told, for example, by the landlord that it's X height, or we've been told by the seller that it's Y height, or our surveyor or valuer has confirmed that, but we can't verify whether that's correct or not, is the stance that I take. And that seems to be consistent with what you're saying, Fiona.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, although I'm not a conveyancer, I've not got any training, I've heard a lot about the kind of retainers and the information that needs to be held in those. And a lot of the conferences that I've been to, it's come up that, there is certain information that you need to make sure that you are obviously advising your clients on, but then there's certain things that you can never advise your clients on, and whether that goes with building safety, or I'm sure a whole kind of other load of things that come within the buy and selling process that you don't actually personally verify, or say that I'm putting my hand on my heart and saying this is true. So yeah, the retainers, and there are obviously people out there who know much more than I do, but yeah, that's a certain piece of kind of information that definitely needs to be within that.
Thanks, Fiona. And just leading on from that then, about higher risk building registration, I think the legislation made it clear, or the regs made it clear, that was going to be a public document, but currently isn't. Now, what's your stance on that? I guess it's outside your remit to make it public, is it?
I am aware that it is due to be made public, but I do not know when. It is the responsibility of the building safety regulator, and that actually comes under the Health and Safety Executive. And that's actually a DWP sponsored body, so actually I'm gonna push that on to my colleagues in DWP, that they're the under HSE and not actually DLUC. But yeah, I am aware it is going to be made public, but no, I have no other information other than that, I'm afraid.
So when you're pushing, can you push for us a little bit as well and say, look, it really would be useful Because if not, what I'm saying to practitioners is you've got to ask the person that registered it to provide you with proof. And if we've got an uncooperative building owner or landlord, that might be an issue.
No,
Okay,
it's certainly
that's
something
fine.
that we can take away as can we get a date?
Yeah. So Zara just raised a question in the chat box there. Had a case where they couldn't measure properly. Yeah, it's going to happen all the time that you can't measure the height of a building, Zara. And all I think you can say to the client is, look, I can't confirm one way or another what the status of this building is, but if it is a relevant building, then this applies. If it isn't, then Schedule 8, for example, doesn't apply. That's how I deal with that, Zara. Anyway, going back to you, Fiona, thank you for that. The next question that we had that I thought was another interesting one, and again, I'm encountering this quite regularly, Fiona, as well. Conveyancers are convinced that if acting on a sale, a landlord certificate must be demanded. And if it isn't, if the landlord is sticking or the landlord is being dilatory, then we've got to pressurise and pressurise and pressurise. Now, I know there was a recent first-tier tribunal decision that said the tribunal does not have jurisdiction to compel a landlord to produce a landlord certificate. But what's your view? First of all, I assume you agree with that as a principle.
Yeah.
So what would you do if if you're in a situation where the conveyancer is in a situation where they're asking a landlord to produce a landlord certificate, and the landlord is just saying nothing or just saying, no, I'm not producing it? What would your view or what would the department's view be in that sort of situation?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the kind of the 4 weeks. So you cannot compel a landlord to produce a certificate. And I do appreciate that sometimes it's nice to have that piece of paper to say, I've got the certificate. But actually, if you've asked for one, the 4 weeks have passed, then you've got the kind of the protection that they cannot pass on remediation costs. As I kind of mentioned kind of at the start, and mentioned, the lenders are aware of this. So if they were expecting to get a copy of the landlord certificate and the 4 weeks has passed, then they should be absolutely fine with it. Move on. We've not got it. We're happy that the protections apply. And your clients, whoever you're working on, whether that's probably the buyer, you can explain to them that then they have the protection from the passing on of remediation costs. It shouldn't be a big deal. And I do understand, because it feels like, well, I've asked for one and I should receive one, but there's been this deadline put in place of 4 weeks, and some landlords are producing letters saying we're not going to produce one because we know actually we would meet the kind of contribution conditions. So here's a letter saying you're not going to get one because I'd have to pay for everything anyway. And take those items as gospel, but also because they've not produced a landlord certificate within 4 weeks, then the protections apply, even if they have produced some sort of letter saying they aren't going to produce an official certificate.
Yeah, thanks for that, Fiona. You see, I do a lot of work with Andrew Butler, Casey at Tanfield Chambers, and his colleagues at Tanfield Chambers, and we came up with the proposition fairly early on in the day that, to be honest, asking for a landlord certificate and getting a landlord certificate, if you're acting for a buyer, is potentially bad news, because there'll be information in a landlord certificate, accountancy information, and I've seen landlord certificates where that accountancy information is pretty heavy stuff. So there's no way as a conveyancer you can criticise the accountant for the landlord in connection with his balance sheet as of the 14th of February or anything. You can't do it. And then the second element, information in the landlord certificate about remediation work for relevant defects, you're looking at that and saying, well, I need a member of the construction team to look at this and give advice on it. So the production of a landlord certificate in some respects creates far more headaches for the buyer than the situation you hit the nail on the head, Fiona, where the landlord should produce it but fails to do it in the 4 week period. I think as a buyer, I breathe a sigh of relief when that's the case, because I think to myself, historical remediation costs aren't going to be a problem for me now, and I don't have to give advice on a document that I can't possibly advise upon, nor do I have to tell my client to go and get specialist advice from a forensic accountant, from a construction lawyer, about what a landlord certificate is containing. So I think that's such an important point, and it terrifies me that I'm seeing conveyancers banging on to landlords about producing landlord certificates. I think you make your request for a certificate, or you notify your intention to sell to the landlord, and then you sit back, diarise your 4-week period, make sure you've got evidence to confirm that you've requested or notified the landlord of sale, and sit back.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think some people, we've seen some correspondence where people think that it's a bad landlord for not producing a landlord certificate, or it's a bad, you know, like receiving this letter saying I'm not going to produce one means that it's a dodgy landlord.
Yes, yes.
But a lot of the time it's not. It's landlords know that they would either have to pay, so so think, well, what's the point in, like you say, producing something, getting their accountants involved, what could be a really kind of labour intensive process to produce a landlord certificate. They know that they're going to have to pay, so they just don't do it. It's not necessarily a bad landlord, I would say.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, I've encountered a landlord who just says, hey, it's not fair that leaseholders are paying these remediation costs, so I'm just happy to take the hit anyway. So I'm not producing a landlord certificate because I'm being very generous and very decent in saying it's my problem, not yours. So there might be a myriad of reasons why a landlord isn't producing a landlord certificate. I've had other landlords have said, I've got to deal with 2 accountable persons that have to produce data and information from me. I've got a previous landlord who has to provide information from me. There's no way I'm going to get that information in a 4-week period to produce a meaningful leasehold, a meaningful landlord certificate. So I'm not producing it. And has been kind enough to say to the conveyancer from the seller and buyer, look, as a consequence of this, you're in a better position.
Yeah.
So I think, as you say, some landlords are being very reasonable and very sensible, which is good news. Now, I'm just looking at a question here from Zara. Just bear with me a moment, Fiona. Yeah. Could you go through what conveyancers would have to do to document the landlord hasn't provided a certificate within the timescale, and how do they fight landlords later on down the line when they suddenly end up with bills? Well, the position is that if a landlord hasn't produced a landlord certificate within time frame, what you do is nothing, Zara. You don't say to the landlord, look, you're out of time. You just leave it. Okay. Where a landlord then is trying to recover remediation costs that are historical costs that are now impossible to recover because the landlord's out of time, that would be a matter that would go to first-tier tribunal, for the tribunal to determine the landlord is not entitled to recover those costs. I think the other point flowing from that point, Zara, is that the failure to produce a landlord certificate when a leaseholder notifies sale or a leaseholder requests it wouldn't preclude a landlord from serving a new landlord certificate where they encounter new remediation costs. Would you agree with that, Fiona? I mean, the situation is, it's not a one hit. You produce a landlord certificate, you're out of time, and that's it. You can't recover any remediation costs ever going forward. It sort of draws a line, as I see it, with regard to historical remediation costs. Now, Zara's right. You could see a situation where a landlord starts arguing, well, I wasn't aware of those costs when I should have produced the certificate. I'm now aware of it. And the leaseholder's turning around and say, well, no, you were aware of it. But that would end up in a first-tier tribunal, as I would see it. Well, great question, Zara. Just before I come back to you, Fiona, another question here. How does it work with remediation costs? If the landlord then produces a service charge bill with the landlord certificate, what protection does the tenant have? Well, I think I've dealt with that, Alison, hopefully. So, Fiona, we'll go back at some of these other questions that we've had already, because I'm conscious that we've got lots of really interesting questions. Next one. Conveyancers insist that they must serve a leaseholder deed of certificate on the landlord, whether demanded or not. Now, I get this all the time. You know, I must serve my leaseholder deed of certificate on the landlord. My view is there's no must about it until or unless the landlord has served a request for a leaseholder deed of certificate. So I'm saying to practitioners constantly, don't volunteer a leaseholder deed of certificate. Produce a leaseholder deed of certificate, make it available for the buyer, because that's the golden ticket that says you've got a qualifying lease. But there is an inherent danger, or there is a detrimental position that can be arrived at if you're simply volunteering a leaseholder deed of certificate when a landlord isn't asking for it. What's your view on that one, Fiona?
I mean, I suppose if you're the landlord, if the leaseholder deed certificate that you're producing or has been produced makes you a qualifying leaseholder,
Yeah.
there is in theory no detriment when if you were to send that along, because you have to send
Yes.
it in physical paper format, hard copy to your landlord,
Yeah.
and then request them for a landlord certificate, because then they'll tick the kind of the relevant box
Yes.
saying we've seen the
Yeah.
leaseholder deed certificate and they're qualifying.
Yeah.
But yes, in the sense of, if you then didn't get one back within 4 weeks, then you've kind of got those protections. Or if you did get one back, then you'd have to produce the leaseholder deed certificate to the landlord. So then the correct box was ticked, because otherwise they might think you were not qualifying, even though you potentially were. But yeah, you can ask for your landlord certificate without producing a leaseholder deed certificate. It's not a kind of a mandate for that request by any means.
Yeah, there is in the certificate itself, and in the guidance that the government produced, there's reference to should produce it, and practitioners will throw that at me, and I think that the implication there is, yes, you should produce it if you're asked to produce it, but the should isn't, you've got to volunteer it. I think that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
And again, the other thing with leaseholder deeds of certificate, I think clients have to understand how important a document that is. So it's something that really needs to be retained safely, on the basis that it is a golden ticket to be transmitted to subsequent buyers, because it confirms to them that they have a qualifying lease as well. Great, thank you for that. I'm just looking at the question from Alex. Buying a maisonette which is managed as part of a building which has a height of 15 metres. Maisonette itself is only 2 stories but is attached to the building which is 15 metres. Would the maisonette be classed as part of a building? Alex, really tricky question. We'll deal with that afterwards. There is excellent government guidance on how to calculate building, part of a building, and height. And immediately when I see that, I think to myself, I'll be scurrying off and having a look at that guidance. But that guidance, I think, is really good and would help in that situation. So I'll leave that, Alex, if that's all right. Thank you for that. Okay. Katie, would requesting a leasehold pack from the landlord's legal representative count as the start of the notice period? Well, this is an interesting question, Katie. This issue about notifying a landlord of your intention to sell has got a number of barristers really sort of jumping up and down as to what notification means. I think a common sense approach, a formal email to the landlord and or managing agent saying I am selling my flat or I have secured a buyer from the flat, must be the sensible approach to take. And if we're requesting a landlord certificate where we're not selling, again, formal request via email, rather than just simply, hey, I'm passing you in the street, I need a landlord certificate from you, again, would make sense. But the Act is quite flexible, isn't it, with this idea of notifying the landlord of an intention to sell. And I think that's quite deliberate, Fiona. Do you? I think that the idea is that you could have a leaseholder who hasn't formally instructed a lawyer to conduct the sale, but nonetheless, as a courtesy, notifies the landlord of the intention to sell. So it could be an email, it could be formal letter, it might be something less than that. But as a lawyer, I think formal notification would make sense. What would you say to that one, Fiona?
Yeah, absolutely. An email or a letter saying, I am looking to sell my flat, or I would like a landlord certificate, please. Those are the kind of types of ways that we would say, within what would be the guidance of notifying intent, or asking for a certificate.
Absolutely. And again, there's no need to say you've got 4 weeks to produce it. You can just simply ask for it. And again, it might be a courtesy to remind, say, a landlord of that fact, but it's not necessary. Right, how do we document this to pass this? Well, you've got to make sure that your client is aware that how important the leaseholder deed of certificate is. Fiona, I read somewhere, or someone told me, that the Land Registry were looking at being a sort of receptacle for leaseholder deeds of certificate. Was that sort of pie in the sky, or do you know that if that's something that's being mooted or discussed?
I mean, it's at the moment there is no plans for any sort of formal register for these sort of certificates, but I know colleagues are thinking about it, and I guess with the importance of them that they are, how do you trust that you are going to pass this document onto the next person, then the next person if necessary. So something, whether it's land registry, whether it's maybe with local authorities, you know, I don't know where it would lie, but certainly nothing in the works yet.
Right, okay.
But definitely definitely something that we're thinking about.
Yeah. And I mean, at the moment, from a practitioner's perspective, you know, unregistered deeds and documents, you tell your client to hang on to them. If the land's unregistered, you know, keep them safe, keep a copy, give your lawyer a copy, and you realise just how important these documents are. I think that has to be the approach that's taken. Hi, Jaspreet. Jaspreet's mentioned something. When I'm acting for a buyer, should I ask the seller's solicitors for the landlord certificate or not, so that my client can be potentially automatically protected by Schedule 8? Well, the point here is, Jaspreet, the failure of a landlord to produce a landlord certificate within 4 weeks of date of request or date of notification of sale, that failure renders the landlord deemed to be meeting the contribution condition, meaning that he can't transmit the cost for remediation work for relevant defects that's historical. Okay, so should you ask the seller's solicitors for the landlord certificate? I wouldn't ask for it. I would just see if it's volunteered. If it's volunteered by the landlord in LP1 or volunteered by the seller's solicitor. What you should be asking for is, have you notified the landlord of your intention to sell? If so, when? Or have you requested a landlord certificate from the landlord? If so, when? That's the way I would deal with that, Jaspreet. But great question. Thank you for that. And I'm just going to look at a question from Jenny, Fiona, and then we'll go back to, you don't mind me sort of dealing with some of these questions just as we go. Okay, if the landlord certificate states there will be costs, but there are still ongoing discussions on the costs, can this still be demanded from the leaseholder through service charge when it later gets clarified? Very technical question, that, as to the content of a landlord certificate, Jenny. So what I'll do with that, I think, is we'll park that, and that's some homework for me over the next sort of week or so. I'll see if I can come up with an answer to that. But the point would be, I think, Fiona, if a landlord certificate is defective, then it is not a valid landlord certificate. And what we've said about the 4 weeks expiring without a valid certificate would apply, wouldn't it?
Correct. And obviously, and again, I suppose we're not, you know, I'd say that we're not expecting conveyancers to read through a landlord certificate and say this is a completely valid landlord certificate, but there are certain things that I've seen where 2 boxes have been ticked in one section. So it makes it, you know, it's clearly filled out incorrectly. So, you know, there are certain things that you might see and think, oh, hang on a minute, that's completely wrong, it's got the wrong address on, or that's not been signed, or, you know, you know, so look out for things like that where you could easily see that it's been incorrectly filled out and the 4 weeks applies again.
So the document is defective as a consequence of an irregularity with regard to its completion, rather than looking at content and saying, hang on a minute, the balance sheet as of the 14th of February is defective, or the construction information can't be right about that remediation work. Again, we're back to what we said earlier, Fiona, scoping the retainer, making sure clients understand what we are doing as conveyancers and what we're not doing as conveyancers. What I always say to practitioners is, look, don't get too hung up about the Building Safety Act. Just think about what we do anyway. Environmental search and report. You're not going to say, oh, hang on, there's contaminated land at the bottom of the garden. It's, I don't know, lead, or it's diesel contamination, and that's going to involve this amount of expenditure, and you're going to have to do this and that. That's way beyond the scope. We're general practitioners, transactional property lawyers, and I think you've got to look at what we're talking about in connection with the Building Safety Act in that context. You know, we're not construction experts. Well, we may be, and if we are, hey, that's fine. We're not forensic accountants. We may be, again, that's fine. As long as the client understands what we're not, then I think it's safe. The only thing I would add to that is watch out for something that someone at Howden Insurance Brokers told me about: retainer creep. If you're saying you're not doing something when you're taking the task on in your retainer, and then during the life of the transaction, you start doing, you say, giving advice on construction or giving advice about accountancy information in a landlord certificate, you're doing something that's beyond the retainer, and that generates danger with regard to claims. You can expand the retainer to cover that issue, but you'd have to explain to the client what the limitations are with regard to the additional work that you're doing. Sorry about that, Fiona. Right, let's have a look at another question. Okay, right. Conveyancers and lenders. One of the things I say to practitioners fairly frequently, Fiona, is look, if you're getting instructions from a lender and they're asking you to verify the height of a building or asking you to verify the content of a landlord certificate or leaseholder deed of certificate, get on to Fiona and her colleagues and ask them to intervene. Now, I know a lot of practitioners are saying, well, yeah, Ian, you finally lost your marbles. There's no way the government's going to help us in that connection. But can you just put your side of things to practitioners? Because I think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, we work with all the large lenders, so people will be, hopefully you're aware of the lender statement from December last year, where the six largest lenders that they would be happy to lend on properties over a certain height. And we've seen a lot, even over the last kind of 6 months, a lot of Part 2s being changed from those lenders to kind of reflect those kind of changes of the wording, so that it's not saying verify anymore. We're not, the lenders are not expecting conveyancers to verify the content of those certificates. We've even got more lenders that are going to be coming into the fold to actually lend on properties. So we're really excited about some announcements that are going to be coming out real soon. But we work really closely with lenders. We want them to be doing the right thing for consumers. If they, like say, if they have offered a mortgage, if they are asking for certain documents that they really think we really know they shouldn't be, then we do need to hear about it, because we're going to hold them to what they've said they've agreed to, and also what they've agreed to within the kind of Part 2s as well. So yeah, we definitely want to make sure that the lenders are doing what they should be doing, and it makes your life a lot easier as well. So if you don't have to ask for these certificates because they know that the building is on the developer remediation list, they shouldn't be asking at all for anything. It should just be, doesn't matter whether someone's qualifying or non-qualifying, the developer's fixing it. So move along, give them a mortgage, let's go. And that's what we want to see.
Good. So some of the second tier lenders and some of the smaller lenders, you're fairly confident they're listening to you, and practitioners will be seeing instructions changing now or some point in the future.
We're working more on those mid-size ones to try and get them to either update or listen to what's happening on the higher up the chain to get more actually involved in this work. And
the other point from a practitioner's perspective is a point that's really CQS related. You should be checking your lender's instructions before you exchange contracts, because lender, as Fiona was saying, some of the middle tier or mid lenders may be changing their instructions. You've got to keep checking your lender's instructions. You must check before you exchange contracts, because the instructions that you received on initially receiving instructions from lender may well have changed. The question from SK we'll have a look at. Hi, SK. Acting for a buyer, landlord has provided a landlord certificate, but no leaseholder certificate was provided to us. Seller has now sent a leaseholder certificate to the landlord. Should I advise the client to wait 4 weeks before exchanging contracts? So you've got a landlord certificate, but no leaseholder deed of certificate. Well, the important point here is it's the leaseholder deed of certificate that you need. And I don't think it's necessary to wait 4 weeks before exchanging contracts. You've got the landlord certificate, and that's the document that really is required within a 4-week period, SK. So I think you could proceed to exchange as soon as you've got the leaseholder deed of certificate. Now, again, as we were saying, with a leaseholder deed of certificate, you can verify some of the information that the leaseholder provides. Lease granted before 14th of February. Lease contains an obligation on leaseholder to pay service charge. Relevant building we've dealt with. So the only issue is ownership or occupation on the 14th of February 2022, which we're going to come on to in a moment or two. So thanks for that question, Nicola. Zara. 4 weeks plus 2 days as per litigation rules. As far as that's concerned, Zara, I would just calculate the 4-week period. I haven't, to be fair, Zara, sort of spent a lot of time looking at the issue of when the 4 weeks expires. Fiona, we're going slightly off piste on this, courtesy of Zara's question, but is it a straight 4 weeks are you aware of, or do you have to allow time for service or receipt of the notification?
I think it's just 4 weeks.
I'll check
I
it.
mean,
But yeah,
the kind of, I mean, I luckily have the legislation up with regards to that. And it
Yeah.
just says within 4 weeks of receipt of notification, or
Yeah.
within 4 weeks of becoming aware, or within
Yeah.
4 weeks of. It's
Yeah.
just within 4 weeks.
Within, yeah, that's so. I'll have a look at it anyway. Right, okay. And then last question I'll take from delegates, and then we'll dive back into the question we've already got. Does the landlord certificate have to follow a prescribed format? And if there is a format not followed, does that immediately invalidate the certificate? I've read something about this. There is a form of certificate, certainly, isn't there, for a landlord? The regs prescribe it. And I don't know whether the prescribed say it's got to the regs say it's got to be in this form or a form similar. I'm not sure on that one.
I think I think it has to be filled out, the actual landlord certificate, the reg, because there was a new regulation from August, and it says the new regulations replace the existing landlord certificate with a simplified version. It's still pretty complicated, but you do have to fill that out. That is the only landlord certificate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, now this is a really interesting question. One of the things right at the very beginning we looked at and noticed was paragraph 13 of Schedule 8, Fiona. And I've been saying to practitioners ever since, look, don't get too hung up about what a leaseholder is saying about their status concerning ownership or of property or occupation of property as of the 14th of February 2022. If there's any doubt about that, or you're doubting the legitimacy of what the producer of the leaseholder deed of certificate is saying with regard to ownership or occupation, paragraph 13 helps you. Because if a landlord hasn't got a leaseholder deed of certificate, and a landlord hasn't taken reasonable steps or prescribed steps under the Act to obtain a leaseholder deed of certificate, then is it section 119(2)(d) doesn't apply, and you don't have to worry about ownership or occupation. You just have to satisfy the first three conditions: lease granted before 14th of February 2022, residential long lease, and an obligation in the lease for leaseholder to pay service charge. First question, Fiona, as far as that's concerned, am I right in thinking just what paragraph 13 of Schedule 8 does? Is my sort of summary correct?
I mean, I suppose it sets out that the lease is presumed as qualifying, unless the leaseholder didn't provide their leaseholder deed certificate on time, if they were asked for one by the landlord. But I suppose, like we have touched on, a landlord could ask for a leaseholder deed certificate or produce a landlord certificate at any point. And then if the leaseholder deed certificate was not produced after that, then it wouldn't be qualifying. It would lose this kind of presumed qualifying status. So if you were planning or working on behalf of a client who was buying a property, 5 stories, 11 metre plus, the best way to show that the lease is qualifying would be to have that leaseholder deed certificate that says it's qualifying. How that, you've got to, I suppose, presume that it was filled in correctly with all the good intentions. So, again, looking through it, is there more than one box filled in each section? If there's 3 boxes ticked in one section, maybe go back to the kind of the seller's solicitor and say, pretty sure this leaseholder deed certificate is not right. But otherwise, again, that kind of looking through each section, making sure the things that you can check are right, then yes, you have to presume that if they're saying they're qualifying, they're qualifying.
Yeah, okay. Right, I'm just looking at this question from Jenny. Landlord certificate I received states there will be fire door works and balcony remediation works to be done, but have not yet started, not in a position to confirm costs. Once they're in receipt of the cost, an updated landlord certificate will be provided. Also in discussion as to who will be liable for costs, so this can still be demanded from my client from service charge. So what we've got is a landlord certificate. Again, Jenny, the issue of the content of a landlord certificate, as I say, I go back to first principles. I'd be saying to the client, look, I can't advise on this. All I can do is draw to your attention what the landlord is saying, and as far as whether those costs are recoverable or otherwise would depend. So I think that becomes a tricky question. Again, if the landlord, what the landlord's saying in the landlord certificate is blatantly wrong, then that potentially would invalidate the certificate. But it doesn't seem to me it is blatantly wrong. They're just saying here we're not in a position to actually specify just what the costs are. The question then is does that invalidate the certificate or not? Jenny, I'm going to park that, and that's one of my questions for my homework. Okay, right. Now then, this is a question I'm asked all the time, Jenny. Sorry, Fiona, all the time. Signing a leaseholder deed of certificate. One, if you're a co-owner, I understand. So we've got Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Mr. Smith only owns this flat. Mrs. Smith is a buy-to-let investor and entrepreneur and has hundreds of the things. If Mr. Smith signs the leaseholder deed of certificate, then he holds a qualifying lease that he can transmit. Is that right? Is that your understanding?
I believe so, yes. I mean,
Yeah.
there are so many scenarios that we do have about this on gov.uk around joint owners, and how many properties, and kind of lots of things that hopefully would address this particular issue. I think with the kind of, I know a lot is raised around executors of estates, and the kind of the sort of the protections or lack of protections that might kind of come up in those circumstances. So yes, the kind of executors will kind of complete and sign the certificate in the same way of anyone who now owns the flat, which if it was owned by someone else on the 14th of Feb 22, if they died before that date, then the flat was treated as owned by the executors for the purpose of working out whether it's qualifying. So there's, you know, I suppose it's one of those sort of situations where it's been brought up. I know that colleagues are looking into sort of probate and joint ownership, and what that does mean for qualifying and non-qualifying status. But unfortunately, how it works out at the moment is maybe not.
What I read, Fiona, was government guidance was that what I said about co-owners, one can sign a leaseholder deed of certificate. I'm sure the guidance was if that person only owned or occupied that flat or had no more than 2 other dwellings, then that would be enough, and it wouldn't matter about the fellow co-owner. Executors, you're right. There's a really interesting paper written by Andrew Butler KC from Tanfield Chambers, and he explains about the status of an executor and the fact that an executor can sign a leaseholder deed of certificate. And also there was some debate about whether the executor signs on the basis of what they own, or whether they sign on the basis of the status of the deceased as of the 14th of February. And I think from memory, Andrew's view was the executor signs and discloses their status, not the status of the deceased, and that would make sense. The other question that I think I posed this one, didn't I, Fiona, about mortgagees in possession. I've had 3 people ask me this, and it's a really interesting question because it's difficult to determine what the status of the mortgagee in possession is. Now, I don't know. My guess is you won't have a view about the mortgagee in possession, and I think what we said in the past is that's one of the things that you might be putting to colleagues.
And if anyone's got an example of it, so it's really good when we've got a kind of hard example of this is the building, this is the circumstance, this is the lender, so we can, you know, we can kind of fully investigate it, because it's not something that, you know, we've had kind of come up before, so we definitely have to take away.
Okay, great. I'm just laughing. We've got a lovely note from Mark Cairns about the land registry involving Christmas party games, Fiona. I'm not going to read it out, but it made me smile, Mark. That's probably one of the nicest things in a chat box I've seen for a long, long time. Our poor friends at the land registry, Fiona, don't half get some stick, to be honest with you. And I've got a dear friend who works for the land registry, God bless him, Jamie Winch, who takes the stick with a great deal of courage and a great deal of decency, which is nice. But yeah, the land registry, boy, do they get flat from time to time. Right, okay. Alison's asking, how do we feed back to you? Alison, I think if we haven't put your email address on the slide, you can sort of at the end of this presentation type it in the chat box and everyone can have a note of it. Alternatively, Fiona, if you're concerned about being bombarded, I'm happy to sort of act as postman and to transmit stuff to you. Right. Yeah, okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. Zara's raised another question there. Zara, that's a homework question, I think. Susie, Leasehold purchase March 22 by first-time buyer, now selling, unknown status of previous vendor. So what advice can I give on completion of leaseholder deed of certificate? Well, if there isn't a leaseholder deed of certificate that's produced, then the current owner would be obliged to produce it, as I understand it, and would have to state the status of the previous owner as of the 14th of February 2022. Sarah, that's my understanding. Fiona, can you shed any light on that one?
Which question was that? Sorry.
This is, I'll read it out. Sarah McGregor raises a question. No, Leah. If a buying or selling flat, no, that's not right. Hang on, where's the question gone? I've lost it. Because we've got so.
So is it if the landlord produces a letter stating they will not be provided?
Yeah, just looking now. I've just lost it now. Bear with me.
Too many
Right,
questions.
yeah, we're getting loads of questions. Right, and I've lost it. Gosh, we're getting. Fiona, these questions are terrifying. Right, we'll have to have a look. I'll have to dig it out and look at that one. Right, let's go back to the questions that we have had already. I thought this would arise. Where are we? Yeah. Higher risk buildings. We've talked about that. Right, here's a question, Fiona. When a landlord meets the contribution criteria, it still appears necessary to insert an actual net worth figure in the landlord certificate. Some landlords have understandable concerns about disclosing this information, especially private individuals. It's not clear why this and the number of relevant buildings owned should have to be specified in actual figures when the landlord is prepared to certify their net worth is in excess of £2 million times N and accept the consequences that potentially flow from this. What's your view on that question, Fiona?
I mean, I suppose it's up to the landlords to fill out the kind of the requirement of the landlord certificate. So we've said before that, you know, there are ones that are saying, I know I meet the contribution condition, I'm not producing a landlord certificate, here's the letter, and therefore the 4 weeks passes. But yes, it is still in there that you do have to provide that full amount. So if you don't want to disclose it, then you're not producing a relevant landlord certificate. I mean, I suppose we could take it back to colleagues if they are willing to change the landlord certificate, but there were some edits earlier on in the year, so I don't think there probably will be any in the very near future.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at another question from Alex, and this is an interesting one. Fiona, why do we have the 14th of February cut-off date? I always thought we have the cut-off date because new leases are subject to the new building regs regime, which means we shouldn't be encountering relevant defects and remediation work for relevant defects. There are parts of the Building Safety Act that do apply to leases that are granted after the 14th of February 2022. That cut-off date, as I understand it, deals with Schedule 8 protection. But if I'm in a higher risk building, the implied terms into the lease, the obligation to register, the duties on the building owner, landlord, accountable person, principal accountable person still apply. But do you know why the 14th of February cut-off date was created by government?
I think it was just a parliamentary timing. I don't think it was necessarily they wanted it to be on Valentine's Day to make it a memorable date for people. It was just purely down to parliamentary timing, that how things came in with the Building Safety Act, that the 14th of February was the date.
Right. Yeah. Okay. But again, you know, the important point there is, as far as new leases are concerned, there are parts of the BSA that will still apply to that lease. Another question here: if a landlord produces a letter stating they'll not be providing the certificate, does this invalidate the 4-week waiting period? I think a landlord could theoretically say that I'm not going to produce a landlord certificate, but then could still produce it in a 4-week period. I don't think it amounts to an estoppel or some form of waiver that prevents it. It'd be an interesting argument, but my guess is that the regs and the Act make it clear that a landlord has 4 weeks to produce a landlord certificate. And if he says, I can't or I'm not, that wouldn't preclude him from doing it. So I'd still wait the 4-week period, to be honest, to answer that question. That was from Helen. Hi, Helen. Right, let's have a look at another one, and then we've got some more questions. Right, gosh. Yeah, right. This is a question from Susie. Leasehold purchase March 2022 by first-time buyer, now selling. unknown status of previous vendor. So what advice can you give on completion of a leaseholder deed of certificate? Susie, I'll take this to start with, and then we'll see what Fiona says. When you've got a client that's completing a leaseholder deed of certificate, my view is you've got to deal with the client in the same way as you deal with him or her when they're answering questions in the TA form. That this is an important document that you've got to complete honestly and fully. That as far as the position is, you've got to try and clarify what the status of the owner of the property as of the 14th of February was. Now, if you don't know who that person was or don't know about their circumstances, then I think you've got a problem on the basis that the current seller can't complete a leaseholder deed of certificate to confirm the status of someone as of the 14th of February 2022, where they have no information about that status. What would you say to that one, Fiona? Have you encountered that?
Agreed. I mean, yes, you do. The person now would have to fill it in, but like you say, based on the information of the person who was the leaseholder on the 14th of Feb 22. So if they knew who they bought it off, and they could get some information from them, whether that's via the kind of conveyancer they used the last time, maybe, that would potentially be a way to trace that person. But if not, then potentially the kind of presumption would be the lease is not qualifying, but it all depends on the building as well. So is the building under the developer remediation scheme? Is it part of a building that's under the kind of 52 developers that have signed the developer pledge, and therefore it doesn't matter? You know, there's potentially other ways that actually a leaseholder deed certificate isn't necessarily the be all and end all.
Yes, I agree with that. So the way I would deal with this, Susie, is this: if I'm acting for the seller, I'm going to warn the seller about the fact they've got to complete this document and they've got to be sure about what they're saying. If they're not, there's a danger of misrepresentation. And I think from a buyer's perspective, I'd be, as I would be warning a buyer anyway, look, you know, if the information contained in this leaseholder deed of certificate is defective, then the deed of certificate is defective, and what you think is a qualifying lease may not be a qualifying lease. So we're back to that dilemma again. Lisa, hi Lisa, is it for us to try and interpret a landlord certificate to ascertain whether the landlord? No, Lisa. Again, I repeat the point. If you're acting for me and you've got an environmental search and report, it's not for you to ascertain the extent of the contamination, the likely cost of decontamination, the likely risk of my being pursued by the Environment Agency. If you're obtaining a climate change report on my behalf or a survey on my behalf, and the climate change report reveals there's a risk of storm damage, or a survey reveals there's an issue with regard to the roof of the building, as a conveyancer, it's not for you to say, hey, Ian, there's a problem with the roof in the building. I think that it needs a new roof, or I think it's nothing to worry about. Just get a roofer to put a few tiles on. You know, it's that sort of thing, Lisa. We're transactional property lawyers, and as long as we scope the retainer so the client is clear as to what we're doing and not doing, then I think we're safe, and we're safe to act. Okay, that would be the point I would make there. Right, now then, let's have a look. We're running out of time, so I've got a few more questions. I just want to deal with these if we've got time, Fiona. Right. Question from someone: where a leaseholder owns 4 or more flats on the 14th of February 2022, I understand that none of the leases can be qualifying leases, and that this is the case even if, say, one of the leases has subsequently been sold to a party who occupies it as their home and owns no other property. Assuming this is correct, it seems unfair on the current owner that they will not benefit from the potential benefits conferred by the Act, just because the property was effectively part of someone else's portfolio on the due date. What's your answer to that one, Fiona?
I mean, that is unfortunately the date. And I suppose if one of the flats was the principal residence of the leaseholder on the 14th of Feb 22, then that property only will have a qualifying lease, and the other 3 flats would be non-qualifying. But the qualifying status is just based on that leaseholder of the 14th of Feb 22 and not the subsequent leaseholders who, you know, may buy that property.
Got it. Okay. I'm conscious of time, and I think our time is just about up. So what I want to do is to, first of all, thank you, Fiona, for your time, for coming along today. Once again, it's no surprise to me. We have been bombarded with questions, and we have lots of questions that were sent in prior to today that we haven't been able to go through. But I promise that I will sort of start that task sort of immediately in the morning to collate what I would think could be a response, and then share that with you, Fiona, for you and your colleagues to have a look at. Michelle's asking, would it be possible for you to put together a synopsis of when it's safe to act, as our firm's insurers have asked us not to act on any flats that has 5 stories or more or 11 metres in height? Drop us a note, Michelle. Drop me a note, and I'll show you there is a pathway that you can take that would enable you to act. I can send you that. We've prepared some material relating to it. There is a cost, unfortunately, relating to that issue. I'll put my email address on the chat box there for that. And Fiona, if you could put your address or email address in the chat box, that would
put it in before, but I will put it in next to yours, Ian, so people have them together.
What I'll do, I'll just skip through lots of slides. We'll make these slides available to you. Just sort of confirms a lot of the stuff that we've been saying. Thank you, Fiona, for doing that. So I'll just skip through to the end of the slides, and I will give you contact details there. And all that I would like to do is, Fiona, once again, a massive, massive thank you to you for your help this afternoon. Any questions, an email address there that's on slide. A massive thank you to Stewart Title once again, Robert, Stephen, Freddie and colleagues. Huge, huge thanks. Fiona, I'm sure we'll be talking again in the new year. I'm fairly confident of that. Thank you so much for giving it of your time. Thank your colleagues from me for the work that they've done over the year and what I'm sure they'll be continuing to do. And everyone that's attended today, thank you for your time. Christmas is nearly upon us. This is the last webinar of the year, Fiona. Can you imagine that? So there might be a little glass of sherry for me this evening. But thanks, everyone. Fiona, thank you. Robert, Stephen, everyone else at Stewart Title. Really enjoyed it, Fiona. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe. And as I say, do fire questions at me or Fiona. We'll compile a list of questions and answers and share that with everyone. Thank you very much. Cheers, Fiona. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.